Everybody. Thanks for joining us for this new edition of ASTC On Air. We have the chance today to speak with Nick Perkins from SideF. And thanks, Nick, for joining us from London today. A grey London, I understand. and we have the chance here in DC to see the sun for the first time in a week. So hopefully I can channel a little bit of that to you. Nick, thanks for joining us again. Those of us who were at the World Summit in Belgium last year have seen you there. But others, and maybe most of our colleagues are maybe not so familiar with you as a person. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became finally came into this position of the director of SideF.
Sure. Well, thank you, Walter, for inviting me to participate in this. As I said to you when you first approached me, I think it's a brilliant idea. So very excited to be here and talking to you and your constituency. So actually, I should start by saying, because I have this this very salutary lesson from my public speaking, where I was once talking and there was a woman sitting in the front row and she was watching me very avidly. And at the end of it, we were networking, and she came over, and I felt sufficiently confident to venture a bit of self-validation. And I said to her, "So did you find that interesting?" And she said, "To be honest, I spent the entire time trying to figure out where you're from, and I don't remember a single thing that you said." So now, actually, to avoid that, I try to always make clear quite early on that I'm from Barbados, and okay. I lived in Canada and Zimbabwe for some time before settling here in the UK, and that explains the accent. There is no Irish, no Welsh. That's what it is. So I actually trained as a journalist originally, and then went to Sub-Saharan Africa, where I started working as a producer, and then started training, and then decided actually to go back to university, and then I trained as an anthropologist, and continued to work in international development with a particular focus on communication. And before taking this position, I was the head of communications, research communications at the Institute of Development Studies out of Sussex in the south of the UK. And I think I often say to people actually that, because of my anthropological background, I understand the business of journalism. I also understand the business of academia and research, but I am naturally a little bit outside of both, which perhaps stands me in good stead for a role such as this one.
Great, thank you. I didn't know that you had this anthropology background, so you see, I discovered something as well. Maybe one day we should talk about the research that you have been doing in that regard. But here today more about SideF then, and so I think most of us know the website, but I guess it's more than that. Can you tell us a little bit about what SideF actually?
Sure. So SideF is, the way we often describe ourselves is we're an online news service that focuses on science and technology for developing countries. Really, in terms of our mission, what we talk about is bringing scientific evidence and technological innovation to development policy and practice. And that mission sets out actually a range of implications for us, both in terms of our objectives, but also in terms of the way that we work. And I think probably, just to understand why that mission is so galvanizing for us, it's worth understanding that, we see repeatedly, even recently we were part of a study with the Elsevier Foundation that looked at the publication of sustainability science, or science around sustainability. And one of the things that was very clear to us quite quickly was that actually only 2% of the research published in this area broadly came out of the developing world. So we feel that there are a dearth of researchers that are being featured in the global knowledge pool, but also a dearth of analysis and voices around that global knowledge pool from the global south, and that this is actually a very important thing if we expect development to have some resonance and to deliver results in the developing world. We also recognize that actually the problem is not just with the production, but it's also with the consumption and the use, as it were. We in 2012 did a survey of around 4,000 respondents around the world in different sectors, and in the sector of civil society, including NGOs who would traditionally work on development, we recognize that in Sub-Saharan Africa, as one example, 92% of the respondents said that their organizations did not systematically use scientific information in their development policy or planning. And this for us is actually, you know, a very sobering statistic. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about this is that actually when you talk to people, you realize that actually, indeed, they are drawing on scientific research and technological innovation, but they don't see it that way because they have a very particular idea of what scientific practice is, and they see it as very other from their practice. And that actually this lack of structural relationships and lack of awareness of these two communities is actually doing us a vast disservice because there's all of this underutilized knowledge.
But Nick, there is a lot of scientists from Africa and other parts of the developing world who leave their countries and they go to universities abroad and they study there. So would you say that if you look at that, maybe the more people involved in that research because they are participating in the research done by American universities, or it's more a problem of resources of the local universities in the developing country rather than a question of personnel? Maybe?
Oh yeah, no, I mean for sure, and this is not an issue of lack of talent or lack of potential, exactly. and I think you're right. I mean, because there are two things to say about that observation actually, which is a very important and astute observation. The first is that actually, you know, what you have as a problem, and I use Africa as an example, but we're talking here about a complex of factors which are not unique to Africa. It's probably particularly obvious in Africa because when you look at the size of the population and the amount of resources across the continent, you know, it feels particularly egregious. But so what you're talking about here is a chronic underinvestment in tertiary level education and capacity, and a lot of this in fact is the entire development project has been complicit in this, because back in the 80s there was a very strong feeling that actually you get a greater return on investment in education if you do it at a primary and secondary level rather than a tertiary level, which meant that actually you had then several years of underinvestment in this area. Belatedly, there's an awareness that we have a problem because, of course, what was happening is that actually, so yes, you take all of these kids, put them through primary education, put them through secondary education, and then what? So, you know, now we see actually an explosion of private universities across the continent, and it also opens up the opportunity for other, perhaps more creative forms of research support and scientific literacy.
Maybe we come back to that.
Really interesting from the perspective of your group and the science centers around the world.
Exactly, I was going to say we're going to come back to that probably at the end of our conversation because yes, it is a direct implication in what we do.
Yes. The other thing I want to say though very quickly about this observation is that, you know, oftentimes we talk about brain drain, but in fact there have been some really interesting examples of what's being called now brain circulation, and SideF actually has been working with, for instance, the Carnegie Corporation. We had a series where we explored the renaissance, as it were, of doctoral research in Africa, and really inquiring about where the problems are and what might be some of the solutions here. And one of the things that we were really struck by were the amount of initiatives that provided opportunities for people to get the best of both worlds, so that they could actually work in the environments that they know very well. This is actually, you know, African PhD and postdoctoral candidates. They can work in environments that they know, environments that they feel very strongly about and very committed to, but they can still actually access the kind of resources that international universities have. And so this is then actually, you know, things like sandwich programs and grants for travel and remittance and that kind of stuff. So some really, and jointly awarded degrees and so on. So some really interesting stuff, and I think, as I say, it's an area actually that provides a lot of opportunity amidst obviously what is occurring.
And looking to it from the distance, and a couple of years ago, I had the feeling that many of students and PhD candidates, etc., in the developing world, they were going for a certain area of research and not everything. And the area of research and that they want to go are things that are really directly of importance for where they are. It is in agriculture, or it is, it's not particle physics necessarily. Is that true?
Yes, I mean, this is broadly true. And the thing is, actually, I'm very wary of making this out to be a zero-sum game, that either you have pure science or you have applied research, and you know
Hmm.
that, because I don't think actually it is like that, and it ought to be like that at all. And there's no reason why, in fact, actually,
No,
African
of course
researchers
not.
or indeed researchers from the developing world shouldn't be even in their context working on some questions of pure science. And I think actually, so I don't want to kind of attempt to quantify in one way or other,
Hmm.
where the emphasis has been. But I think what is really important here is actually about whatever the research is when it comes to applied research, really understanding the context in which it's meant to be used and thinking quite carefully about who will benefit and who might not benefit. So, kind of doing a little bit of analysis from the perspective of the political economy, thinking a bit about well-being frameworks and so on, and using that to unpack some of the social and economic implications of the research
Sure.
that might be
And,
done.
and, and keeping the timing in mind,
Mhm.
I want to move on a little
Sure.
bit. So, SciDev significantly, certainly has an impact on these communities that we describe. But if there a way that you can track whatever the impact is that you do, how do you see that what the work that you do really matters?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, we have our own sense of pride that we depend on a day-to-day basis. But I mean, more substantively, obviously, we there are probably three broad areas that I would say we reflect on when we think of impact. I mean, the first is really about the reach of our content, because we are fundamentally a media outlet. We are producing original journalism. And yes, it's true, there's also a stream of our work which is about capacity building to support science communication for researchers and for journalists. But there again, the issue is still the same, is actually what is the reach? How many people are visiting the site, or how many people are engaging with us on social media, or indeed, how many of our articles are being republished on other media outlets, because we encourage that actively, and we've been actually very fortunate that actually there are a lot of media outlets and information networks that will take our content. So that's one very significant area for us and quite important. But there's also the stuff that happens actually with the content itself, and here is what we call intermediate outcomes. So one of the things that we've discovered is that actually people will share our content, what we call tactical sharing, where they'll see something and they'll think, oh, this is important actually for me to send to a colleague, or to a peer, or indeed to a supervisor or a line manager or something. And so that sort of stuff happens quite a lot, and particularly if a piece is successful and resonates, we'll see that happening a lot. But then you also have issues around kind of people saying that actually something has mattered for their personal learning. And of course, actually, as part of this intermediate outcome, what we will see is actually policy impact, or shifts in practice. And so we have examples, for instance, of stories that came out just last year around the elections, presidential elections in Madagascar. We did a story actually about the place of science in the presidential elections, and how marginalized it was given the context of the country, particularly at that time. And this story was picked up by national media, and then there was a discussion with the presidential candidates about science as part of their platform specifically, and so it gave it a very particular profile, and shaped the policy agenda in that regard. And these are the kind of stories as well that we'll track quite closely. And then, of course, the other thing is that actually we will talk about the kind of epistemic qualities of the work that we produce. So we will often do surveys of our readers, or we'll do surveys with advisory groups in the regional editions that we have, where we will ask them to rate the quality of the content across various places and so on. And part of that is really about the extent to which they've found the content useful, as a reflection of a body of research that we may have featured in one of our stories, and so on. And so that's quite an important measure of our impact as well.
And so today and over the last days, a significant thing has happened, which is that the UN has decided what the next sustainable development goals will be after a long process of discussion, as it's usual in the UN. How important is that for SciDev and for the developing world, and science in the developing world?
It's extremely important. Potentially the most significant discussion that we've had for 15 years about development since the MDGs. Although it is interesting because the Africa Union is also pushing ahead with what's called Agenda 2063, and this isn't the African agenda for development. And it's not actually necessarily in conflict, but the point actually is that African leaders have said, you wouldn't expect the EU to sit around and wait for the UN to ratify the SDGs to determine what would be regional priorities for the European Union. And similarly, we shouldn't expect the same thing of the Africa Union, that they would sit around and wait. And so that's just fair enough. I mean, what is interesting is the amount of overlap that there is there. Now, to talk specifically about the SDGs, I mean, what is interesting for us, those of us who are working in the field of science, is first of all understanding the approach here. And what the SDGs do is that they bring together three quite significant areas: the concern with economic growth, or inclusive economic growth as they call it, a concern with environmental sustainability, and a concern with social justice and inclusion. And so the idea is that the goals are expected to reflect all of these, not to privilege one over the other necessarily, but actually to recognize that these are all interrelated in the kind of future that we envisage for ourselves. The other thing that's really important actually with the SDGs, and it's worth us thinking about, is, and I think particularly again thinking about the global community of science centers, is the emphasis on global partnership. So development is not seen or conceived of as something that's done to a certain group of countries. It's not seen as a responsibility that only a certain group of countries take on. It's actually seen instead as an activity or a project which is truly global, where everybody has responsibility to play a particular role. Because actually it's no longer tenable to be able to, as a nation, to be able to protect yourself or remove yourself somehow from this global development project, particularly the sustainable development project.
And is it fair to say that actually in the process of deciding them, this principle was already in the production of the new sustainable goals as well? There has been more involvement of the society at large in the discussion?
Yeah, no, and indeed it has actually. It's been quite crucial, and it's a really interesting example as well of science being able to influence actually global policy, because the Sustainable Development Framework, a lot of this has come out of the focus on sustainability and the science around sustainability, and this is how it shaped the framing, the paradigm, as it were, going forward. And so I think that there is, in fact, tied up in this, there's already a pretty significant achievement for the scientific community, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that actually, because it's come in a way that perhaps we don't often anticipate, but I think it's a very real achievement nonetheless. And yes, it's true. One of the things that they've been doing is actually trying to engage more with civil society and with science. So, for instance, ICSU, the International Council of Science, they were involved in a consultative capacity. You also have the Sustainable Development Solutions Network were involved as well, and so you have there've been a number of networks that have been engaged around this. Now, the extent to which actually these networks would have seen their particular body of knowledge or particular recommendations survive the expediency, shall we say, that goes into the negotiations between countries is a different question. And I know that, for instance, ICSU was quite concerned about a number of the indicators that were developed in particular. But I mean, yes, it was encouraging, and then certainly SideF, we have a landing page that we have created on the site for stories that relate to the Sustainable Development Goals, and we have been ourselves co-conveners of a number of activities, including with Amina Mohammed, Special Advisor to Ben Ki-moon on the post-MDG framework. She came along to a couple of events that we had talking about how we might engage science in this development process, and so it bodes very well. The other thing is actually around the data revolution, which is supposed to underpin the delivery of these new goals. Again, an important opportunity here, and certainly from our perspective, where we bring always a certain, we as a SideF bring a certain amount of what we call healthy skepticism to bear, an area that we will be monitoring quite closely. And the idea is that basically we now have the capacity to be able to gather enough data in theory, in principle, to allow us to be accountable around the delivery and the achievements of these goals. And what we need to do is to be investing in that capacity, both in the physical capacity, technological capacity, but also, of course, in the human resources that would allow us to maximize the returns on increased data literacy. And that's a pretty big project, and again, something that SideF has been following quite closely, the data revolution.
You mentioned it, that there is some questions about it, and broadly from the scientific communities, that okay, we have the goals, they have been discussed with a number of partners, and they are probably attainable and quite democratically decided and all of that, but some of them are not precise enough, and the science does not necessarily underpin exactly what the goals stand for. So there is a little bit of a back and forth on this. We don't seem to be totally ready from the scientific point of view of how they have been defined, and the objectives and the measurement, as you said earlier, that we could put in place, that could be put in place to see if we're really going to make progress against them.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think actually, and you're right, I mean, because, the thing is, when it comes down to it, of course, the SDGs are a fundamentally political project. And it would behoove us to remember this. So, I mean, and Amina Mohammed was, very clear about this in I remember certainly one of the meetings that we had with her, is that, the folks are going to want something which is obviously reasonably rigorous, sufficiently rigorous that people feel that, they can be accountable around it, but it has to be light enough to fly. So you don't want something that's going to be cumbersome in its rigor. It has to be an idea that's communicated quite easily and will be sticky, so people get it and they can get behind a narrative around it. And I mean, and I can understand that, I do. But yeah, there's a problem here. They have 17 goals, so you have this Christmas tree structure, 17 goals, 304 indicators. I mean, there are very, very few countries in the world that would have the capacity to monitor 304 indicators in addition to national agendas. So that's the first problem, is that actually you've come up with this thing where, in fact, it's quite cumbersome. Also, a lot of these goals a lot of these indicators in particular are not what we would call smart, as in they're not realistic, they're not measurable, they don't actually reflect the latest science or practice around how to measure outcomes or public goods in particular sectors, and I can see actually there are a lot of things actually about which to be concerned, and I think, but this is to me actually an opportunity for an ongoing conversation.
And I was going to say that I think that you have maybe a role there then as this media outlet and this special focus that you have on that. So how do you see your role and the role of SideF in the future accompanying this implementation of these goals and getting the conversation going and reminding the people about the balance that needs to be seen between the political objectives of this, which are extremely important, and then how good we can measure impacts.
Yeah, no, and the thing is here actually, we have it's a bit of a complex of challenges, because on one hand you're operating this arena of policy, which is again, really based on political expediency, but then you're also meant to be working with a body of partners who are not as au fait with academic practice and research as we might like. And here I'm talking about NGOs themselves and line ministries and southern governments. And so, you need to also be making a case there with them that actually, there is research that's going on actually, and in fact we have this this global pool of knowledge which we should be better at mining and sharing. So, these are some of the complications that we're dealing with. So fundamentally, we see kind of three areas where we think science can make a difference to the SDGs. One of these I've referred to before, which is actually around kind of, the framing and the organizing principles within the SDGs, where actually you take the discourse, as it were, that's happening in science, and you think, okay, how do you make that make sense for politicians or for policymakers or for program managers. And we talk about the SDGs. You have the 3 principles. There's also this notion of donut economics, where you have actually the ceilings of environmental systems, and you create the safe and just space in between. And so there's some big narratives actually which science has played a really significant role in shaping, and we must remember that, and we must recognize the value that has, because again, if you're talking about communicating ideas, this is extremely important. Now, I recognize, of course, that to be able to achieve that, there's a process that you go through, which is actually kind of really about the nuts and bolts of scientific practice, and contributing and the peer review and all that kind of process. But the point is that you can still look at the big picture. Then the second area for us, which is particularly important, is actually making researchers and scientists, including those in natural sciences and life sciences, aware of the social context in which they are working. And there is this story, which is probably apocryphal, where Nixon is talking to advisors and says to them, actually, don't tell me the facts, tell me what they mean. And this idea that actually we need to remember to sort of step back for a moment and think about the socio-political implications of what we're discussing. And this is extremely important. Again, one of the things that we saw come out of the survey that we did a few years ago was many people outside of academia saying one of the biggest frustrations they have with actually being able to work with scientists is the lack of awareness of the socio-political implications. And while it's obviously not fair to expect researchers to understand all of the socio-political implications, still to have actually some awareness of the fact that this is going to be quite an important dimension to the work that you're doing is, to me, quite fundamental.
And when I used to word politics in the same way, it was in the noble sense of the word, not like politic in a negative way. I think there is a political agreement there where there are a lot of people, there is a consensus, and something that we really should put forward as a goal that everyone stands behind. So it was not meant in a negative way.
No. And I agree with you, actually. And I think this is because actually people think of politicking and, and they think, oh, it's all horrid. And actually, I think there's a concern that, first of all, I have to know everything and anticipate everything. But it's a very simple thing. I'll give you a really concrete example, the God particle. So, of course, there was all of this, the media was really interested, it's kind of all this, everybody's in a tizzy. But the one question that people really want to understand is, okay, what does that mean? And it was very difficult to find scientists who would say, actually, you know what, we don't know. But imagine, it's like the electron, and the implications for our lives we can barely grasp if you think of the electron and the role that it now plays in our society. And that is enough for people to think, aha. But that's quite a difficult thing to get people to, to have researchers who can articulate that. And that's really, to me, about cultivating this as part of culture. I mean, and we have written about this on the site many times about the opportunities and ideas about how we can actually cultivate that particular sense of social awareness in science.
And that brings us back to the earlier conversation that we pushed a little bit to the end, and we are at the end in the meantime, it's going very fast, is that, how do we, as communicators to the public about science and wanting to have, including the development goals into the work that we do, how should we do that? And one thing that I wanted to say about your remark earlier, the impact and the efforts to do on elementary schools and secondary level schools to make kids interested in science are important, is that if there is no higher education available, where would they go? One thing is that, at least from the studies that we know about, young people in developing countries have more positive views about science and what science can do for them than in developed countries, and and so there is hope there that if we can stimulate that and support that enthusiasm that there is for science being a tool for development, there's something that we can work with, right?
No, and I agree completely. I mean, and in fact, you see this reflected as well in science journalism. Science journalists in the developing world are much more optimistic about the practice of science journalism than those in the developed world or in OECD countries. So I hear that. But just to answer your question very precisely and very quickly, the third area, because I talked about the first two, actually kind of the framing of the narrative and also the kind of increasing the social awareness of social context amongst the researchers. But the third is really about increasing scientific literacy across the general population. This is extremely important, and you know, it comes back to this Rolle's hypothesis, as it were. There was an epidemiologist who thought that actually, initially was thinking, you know, the best way to manage cardiovascular disease in populations is really to lower the blood pressure of those who are most vulnerable. But then he realized that, in fact, no, the best way to manage it is to lower the mean blood pressure of the general population. So it's the same thing. So rather than actually thinking, oh, we need a few people who are going to be particularly scientifically literate, we probably will get better results if we increase the mean level of scientific literacy for populations across the world. And this is where we need outreach mechanisms, whether it's SideF and its original journalism, or it's the science centers and their own programs of outreach. You know, this is where we need to do stuff. And I personally, I'd be very happy to explore with science centers, you know, some kind of exhibition that's focused around science for the goals. I mean, there are at least 10 of the existing 17 goals where the role of science is very clear, and I think would be very exciting to explore.
And that was going to be my last question. Is there space for us to find a dialogue between you and the science centers so that we can build something that would really be a support, and in the same way as you do, a sort of a critical but support to what the development goals are, but with the end goal of making, you know, the planet a better place?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd like to think so. I mean, as you describe it, this is there's a lot of convergence, you know, with our own goals. And I think, you know, one of the things as well that opens up possibilities to work with the science centers is that actually, you know, SideF is very careful not to align itself to any particular research or researcher, because obviously what we pride ourselves on is our function as an independent knowledge broker, as with all good science journalism. But as a science center, you're also curating from the body of knowledge from across epistemic communities, as we are. So surely there is actually an opportunity here for us to leverage our comparative advantages to do something.
And I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it here, and our time is up. But certainly the space is open for further conversation, and I hope that in the very near future we find places to continue that dialogue. So thank you very much, Nick, for this conversation.
No, thank you,
exciting, Walter. And hope we follow up in the very near future.
Yes, I look forward to that.
Have a good day in London.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.